Long Island's biochemical research facility experienced a massive explosion, causing toxic gas to leak from the base. These deadly gases quickly rose into the atmosphere, turning what was a clear sky into one filled with thick, dark clouds. Local news stations immediately broadcasted emergency warnings, notifying residents that acid rain would soon fall, advising everyone to stay indoors and avoid going outside at all costs. As time passed, the sky grew darker, and the predicted downpour arrived in full force. At that moment, a man had just hung up the phone when he heard the broadcast warning about the acid rain. Dismissing the danger, he scoffed, "It's just a bit of acid rain," and decided to step outside to enjoy the experience. However, the toxic chemicals mixed with the rain were far deadlier than he had imagined. The moment he stepped out of his car, he felt a burning sensation on his skin. Realizing something was wrong, he tried to rush back inside, but it was already too late. The rain was eating away at his flesh, the searing pain spreading rapidly throughout his body. Worse still, this acid rain wasn't just corrosive. It also triggered a horrifying transformation, turning those exposed into bloodthirsty zombies. Meanwhile, inside the police station, people were still unaware of the growing crisis outside. A woman, frustrated after being unable to resolve a traffic violation due to a system error, had a heated argument with a female officer before storming out of the station. The moment she stepped through the door, the acid rain began to corrode her flesh. The female officer, shocked by the horrific sight, froze in place for a moment. Desperately, she called for her colleagues, who rushed out with tarps, dragging the woman back into the station. But by the time they brought her to the coroner's office, it was too late. The woman had already succumbed to her injuries. The bizarre nature of the incident piqued everyone's interest, including a journalist who was at the station for an unrelated interview. On the other side of the station, the female officer, still rattled, gazed out at the heavy rain, filled with questions. "Why is this rain so corrosive?" she wondered. Out of curiosity, she opened the door slightly to investigate further, but a thick fog obscured everything. Just as confusion filled her mind, a zombie suddenly leaped out of the rain toward her. Terrified, she slammed the door shut and ran back to the police office, her heart racing, ready to report the chilling situation to her colleagues. However, things took a strange turn as both the radios and phones mysteriously stopped working. Meanwhile, in the morgue, the forensic team continued examining the woman's body. The coroner, a seasoned professional, had seen it all, until now. This situation was unlike anything he had encountered before. Determined to find out the cause of death, he told his assistant to lift the tarp covering the woman's body. In his haste, the assistant accidentally spilled some of the acid rainwater that had collected on the tarp onto a nearby heavy-set officer's face. Instantly, the officer screamed in agony as the acid burned his skin. Panicking, he ran to the restroom to wash it off, but in a cruel twist of fate, the faucet wasn't working. The acid rain kept eating away at his flesh, and with a final, heart-wrenching scream, he collapsed to the ground. One of his colleagues, alarmed by the screams, called out to him, but when there was no response, he bent down to check if the officer was okay. Just then, in a horrifying turn of events, the heavy-set officer suddenly reanimated, now fully transformed into a zombie. With terrifying speed, he lunged at his colleague, sinking his teeth into the man's arm. At this point, the officers who had been in the morgue returned to the main station, while the female officer explained everything that had just happened. The chief attempted to establish contact with the outside world, but as feared, all communication systems were down. Meanwhile, in a different part of the station, a reporter was interviewing a prisoner while a cameraman filmed nearby. During the shoot, the cameraman suddenly heard strange noises coming from the restroom. Driven by curiosity, he walked in without hesitation to check it out. Noticing his absence, the reporter called out a few times, but when there was no response, he decided to follow him into the restroom. Just as the female officer was passing by, having just left the main office, she heard screams coming from inside the restroom. She rushed to push open the door, and the sight that greeted her was horrifying. The reporter was violently attacking the cameraman, who collapsed moments later. Believing that the reporter had gone mad and was committing murder, the officer immediately commanded him to drop any weapons. The reporter, however, looked utterly confused and innocent, trying to explain himself, but even he had no idea what had just transpired. As the standoff between the female officer and the reporter continued, the cameraman suddenly got back on his feet. The officer's attention was diverted, but in that moment, the reporter attacked her. In the chaos, the cameraman, now fully transformed into a zombie, lunged at the reporter, sinking his teeth into her neck. Panicked and bleeding, the injured reporter stumbled out of the restroom, while the female officer, who had been knocked down, came to, only to be bitten viciously in the face by another zombie. Meanwhile, inside the main office, 3 officers were completely unaware of the nightmare unfolding just outside. It wasn't until a zombie appeared at the door that they realized the gravity of the situation. The sheriff, in a state of shock, suddenly remembered that his son was somewhere in the station. The last he had seen him was in the morgue. Desperate to find his son, the sheriff made the decision to head to the morgue. Despite their growing fears, the other 2 officers reluctantly agreed to go with him. After gearing up with their weapons, the officers swiftly dealt with the zombie pounding on the door. Meanwhile, the coroner was inside the morgue, looking for his assistant. As he entered the room, he was stunned to find the corpse on the table missing. His confusion was short-lived, as a zombie suddenly leapt out from the shadows. But the seasoned coroner remained calm, quickly drawing his knife and dispatching the zombie without hesitation. Just as he exhaled in relief, he noticed his assistant, now fully transformed into a zombie. Without wasting a second, he decisively took down his assistant as well, securing a second kill. Yet, the ordeal was far from over. As he stepped into the inner room, he caught sight of a strange, eerie figure moving in the distance. Moments later, a grotesquely twisted zombie emerged, walking with an unnatural, contorted posture. The horrifying sight left the coroner momentarily frozen in fear. Before he could react, the zombie lunged forward, biting into him with brutal force, killing him instantly. Meanwhile, the sheriff and his 2 colleagues arrived at the bathroom where the female officer had been attacked. When they opened the door, all that remained were bloodstains on the walls. There was no sign of any bodies. In the chaos, the prisoner they had detained had also escaped. Suddenly, a zombie appeared at the end of the hallway. Howie reacted quickly, taking it down with 2 clean shots. The trio pressed on, determined to find the sheriff's son as soon as possible. But they didn't get far before Howie heard a low growl. Just as he was about to investigate, the zombified female officer silently ambushed him from behind. Caught off guard, Howie was bitten on the neck. In a desperate struggle, he managed to shove the zombie away and immediately fired a shot, killing her. However, the wound was too severe, and Howie soon collapsed from blood loss. Lance rushed over to check on him, but to his shock, the zombie officer wasn't fully dead yet. She lunged at Lance again. Acting fast, Lance fired a shot straight into her head, finishing her off for good. After bandaging his wounds, Lance and the sheriff continued their way toward the morgue. On their way to the morgue, the sheriff and Lance encountered a mutated, hulking officer. Despite the officer's slow movements, his sheer size and unnatural strength made him a formidable threat. The sheriff had to empty his entire magazine just to bring him down. Staring at what was once a colleague, the sheriff felt a wave of sorrow and disbelief. The brutal end of his fellow officer hit him hard, but he couldn't afford to dwell on it. His son's safety was the priority, and he forced himself to push through the pain. Soon after, they ran into a prisoner who had escaped during the chaos. The man, frantic and claiming he wasn't infected, begged for his life. Given the urgency of the situation, the sheriff and Lance barely had time to process his plea. They told him to get out of there quickly, but before the words had even finished leaving their mouths, a zombie leaped from the shadows, attacking the prisoner. Amidst the struggle, the sheriff and Lance seized the moment to make their escape, rushing past a fire door. At last, they reached the entrance to the morgue. However, fate is often cruel. When they pushed open the door, the sheriff was heartbroken to find that his son had not waited for him. Instead, he had fallen victim to the mutated coroner. In that moment, the sheriff felt as if his heart had been shattered, sinking into deep despair. Despite Lance's persistent urging for him to leave quickly, the horde outside had already broken through the door and was closing in fast. Lance managed to take down one zombie, but the others surged in like an overwhelming tide, trapping him in the room. With his son's death weighing heavily on him, the sheriff lost all will to fight for survival. Faced with the approaching horde, he chose not to resist, but rather to accept his fate with a calm resignation. In the end, he opted for a dignified death,